Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Dev in the Details, the podcast where we're looking to cut through some of the noise in the AI space and talk about what it's taking to actually build, deploy, and operate AI in the real world. Today, I'm actually really excited to be able to go off the back of OpenAI's Developer Day announcement around AgentKit and talk a lot about agent builders and the rise of agentic platforms that have really come up. Over the past year, we've seen a wave of tools promising to let just about anybody build an AI agent in a few minutes. But I think there's a catch. Building agents has become easier and easier. There are natural language prompts, some access to tools. But I think a lot of the things that go around building the agent, deploying it safely, having guardrails, evaling agents, knowing if that they're falling in your governance framework, being able to improve them when things go wrong, I think that's where most teams are actually hitting the wall when they think about going from a pilot into production. So that's what I want to spend a lot of our conversation here today. I want to talk a little bit about the recent OpenAI launch and then what that will mean for the future of agents and agent systems. Today, I'm joined by my co-founder and CTO, Travis Addair, who we had a great conversation just about a couple of weeks ago. And we're going to be now unpacking why agent builders alone aren't going to be enough to take you into production. So Travis, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here again, Dev.
Cool. Let's start off with just a little bit of the basics for everyone who may have missed it. So on Monday, OpenAI had their developer day, and I think the biggest piece of news that really stood out to me was they introduced something called AgentKit. Now, AgentKit I think about as three real key products. One of them is this visual canvas, as they describe it, for creating agent workflows and kind of like this drag and drop style interface. The second is their connector registry for being able to connect it towards a lot of different tools and products. And the third is actually an Evals product. And so being able to take this idea of like this pre-built agent workflow and then tie it into, Evals, which has gotten some really nice quotes. And I want to understand how this would actually work directly in practice. So congratulations, I think, to OpenAI on this launch. Certainly gotten a lot of buzz. Maybe the first thing I want to ask you about, Travis, is, I was actually at a lunch with a number of IT leaders today, and they were still wrapping, I think, their heads around what exactly AI agents means from what's net new versus what's already existed. So, to give some more background there, robotic process automation and UiPath has been something that's been deployed in a lot of organizations where they're building bots to automate back office channels. Then you had things like Zapier, which were also doing simple workflow automations. And in the more AI native world, we've had, N8N, I think, be a really popular open source framework, probably the most popular one that I see today represented inside of enterprise organizations when it comes towards agent development and deployment. And now, finally, we have the OpenAI AgentKit that's just been put together too, as well. Let me just ask you, who do you think, like Twitter and everyone, Reddit, everyone's trying to figure out who's OpenAI killing with their launch of AgentKit now. Whose lunch do you think they're going to eat? Do you think it's going to be like open source agent builders like N8N? Do you think it's going to be legacy industries like UiPath and RPA? Something in the middle like the developer tools like Zapier? What are your thoughts on that market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like something that's very much evolving, but I think when you look at the space broadly, it's, in one sense, it's like everyone's trying to solve the same problem, which is how do we automate business processes that are currently done by humans, like at scale in the enterprise. And I think that ranges from like the most general, where you have like just these verticalized applications like the Harveys of the world that are like automating some parts of like legal work, all the way down to the most specialized, where people are building custom agents using lane chain and lane graph and like low level developer tools, and people are spinning up 20-person teams internally to address these problems. And so the question is really like, to me, is like, where does this sit in that spectrum of like, fully verticalized to, fully developer, tool oriented? And ultimately, what's the TAM of like where they sit in that space? Like, is this a problem that's, going to drive, trillions of market value, or is this like a pretty niche problem that like, maybe they'll solve some simple use cases, but it's not really going to matter that much in the long term? With AgentKit, I wouldn't necessarily say that like they're going all the way for, like the Lang chains and the Lang graph style, like agent builders, the low level developer tools. It definitely feels like they're closer to targeting the RPA side, where it's like a little bit more like drag and drop interfaces, pre canned integrations. But I think what's kind of interesting about um, AgentKit, when you compare it to something like N8N or even UiPath or Zapier, is that at least as it's envisioned today, it's like really more of like a chat bot builder rather than like a process automation tool.
Hmm.
It's like that really they don't have like kind of clear triggers in the same way that like those other tools do to be like, oh, when you get an email, then automatically trigger this workflow to do XYZ. It's more like there's some kind of chat widget that you can hook into, and then, it's going to be ultimately driven by some natural language communication with a human as like at least the first use case they're targeting. Is that going to be the end state? I don't know, but it does seem like that's been the way they've tried to avoid the direct comparison to something like a Zapier right out of the box.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe to your broader point about like, you know, what does this mean for agents versus RPA tools? I guess one observation I'd have there is that it does feel like these products are fundamentally on a collision course where, all RPA tools will be agent builders and vice versa in the limit. And in fact, like I didn't even know this until doing a little bit of research for this recording, but N8N started in like 2019 or something like that, and it
I
was
did not know that.
it was actually just like basically an RPA tool that like now they've managed to shoehorn in like all this additional um, agentic stuff into it, right? So it does feel like that's where things are ultimately going. Is like all RPA tools will be agent builders, presumably. And I guess the like what's the value of doing that is like, well, with traditional RPA, you can only really solve very deterministic workflows. And now with like the power of agents, you can solve more fuzzy, contextual problems of like, oh, do I route it this way or that way based on what the human is asking me to do in natural language? Like it's a bit more non-deterministic in that sense.
That's actually fascinating. I didn't even know that. And for as much as I've been seeing N8N come up in conversations, I didn't really know that it was started in 2019, pre Gen AI either. And I had a suspicion that if we looked at the star chart, it would sort of look something similar to this. So, first of all, huge shout out to N8N. I think they're past 140,000 GitHub stars so far. And I know that to some extent it's a vanity metric, but also it's a real showcase of like brand awareness. So you can see they were, reasonably popular during what I'd call like the N8N wave, the RPA wave early, but they've just taken off in the last year, year and a half. And so I think that really underscores, your point that you're making earlier. Let me ask you the question. I asked a few of my friends at OpenAI about this because this is the thing that I'm the most curious about, which is you kind of gave this breakdown between developer tools and these like higher level abstractions. I think that this paradigm and like this tension has existed for the longest period of time ever. Travis, you and I were building a low code ML platform 3, 4 years ago. And the idea was like you could have a UI help you train deep learning models. There's always been this idea that like engineering is too hard for everybody to be able to do, and we need UIs to be able to be stuck on top of it. I think historically that hasn't worked that well. I'm curious for your take on, is this time going to be different? Do you think that this drag and drop canvas is a good way to go? And then after that, I actually want to share my view too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways it feels like it's a new problem where it's like how much AI do you have to build versus buy? But I actually don't think it's that different from like the way it's always been with software, where the question of build versus buy has existed for decades. And I think you can see this in like different types of organizations where it's like, why is it in some organizations all software slash IT reports to a CIO, and why is it sometimes report to a CTO? And in some ways, that's exemplary, in my opinion, of like whether the organization thinks of themselves more as like a software builder or a software buyer. Um, and so I think that you have something like that playing out now with AI, where some organizations are going to be looking at like how can they just like integrate a tool that will automate some relatively generic process. But there's two ways where I think that there's always going to be a place for the more custom and bespoke. One is for the type of software that you would build that's like intellectual property, right? Where it's like, I'm going to build this software system and I'm going to go sell it and try to build a market and build a product around that. I don't think you're ever going to use like a WYSIWYG editor or something like that to build that kind of software, because you're talking about something that's ultimately supposed to be at the bleeding edge of what someone could go and buy on the market. But I think there's also another category, which is even for internal use cases and applications where it's not like, my, IP that I'm going to go and like market to customers. There's always going to be some category of work that you're doing that is extremely specific to the nuances and intricacies of the organization. And the question there is like, how much of that can be compartmentalized into like generic like steps that could be automated with like something more simplistic, versus how much is like the whole process just so convoluted, so complicated, so bespoke that the software solution has to be equally as complicated and bespoke. I don't know that there's like a clear answer there. I think that's why there's so many competing solutions to this problem. Is like some agent builders like Agentforce and Copilot Studio take this kind of middle of the road approach where it's like it's flexible, but there's only so much that you can do. Whereas others are, like, hey, this is like the one solution that you have to adopt, and it's supposed to solve all your problems. And if it can't, then you're out of luck. All the way down to like the low level tools.
So
So
what's your prediction then, Travis? Because I agree, like there's different use cases and different reasons for it. But I'll also say, I think no UI based ML tool really took off in the last like 6 to 7 years.
yeah,
So maybe like if I were to press, would you like if you were to make a prediction going 3 years out, seems insane in AI space. Do you think that the majority of the agent applications that are used, not necessarily by volume, but let's just say that are used, are going to be built using like a no code WYSIWYG UI? Or do you think that they're going to be built low code style, with prompts chained together with an open source orchestration framework?
yeah. So I think that my prediction would be the majority of the value creation in terms of like actual productivity improvement and for an organization, cost reduction will come from custom solutions, because I think that that's where there's the most room to improve. It's like, oh, we're doing something really inefficient. It's costing me millions of dollars a year. If we can automate that in some way, that'll make a huge difference. But I think there's probably more low hanging fruit in the more simple stuff, right? Like if I'm, some random person in the organization, some part of my day, like maybe it's 30 minutes, maybe it's an hour, is going to be spent on something relatively generic, uninteresting, rote that I'd much rather automate. And I think there is probably a real use case for like these low code tools, or rather, I guess what we're saying is like WYSIWYG tools, where it's like, kind of visual, like a visual coding type tool that like you don't have to be a software engineering team to build.
Yeah.
Um, so in terms of like the number of applications that are being built, there will probably be more of those, is my guess, just because everyone in the organization is going to want to build at least a handful of these to make their own lives easier and more efficient. But I
Yeah.
don't think that's where most of the value unlock is going to be.
You think most of the value unlock will be in the custom? Yeah. I think that the volume of tokens processed will be highest on the custom built with code agents. But I think the over volume of, let's just say, daily active agents will actually be highest with these drag and drop agent builder UIs. And I think that's actually meaningfully different than the rest of software. Like most websites in the world are not built, I think, someone should go ahead and fact check me on this, but I think like most websites in the world above, let's say, some minimum threshold of usage are not built with a, let's say, no code builder. They are built, using some frameworks and some amount of code. But I think with agents, actually, you're going to see a lot of them being built directly through these connected UIs. And I think that's actually a deviation from a lot of other previous tech trends, despite the fact that we've hoped things would have existed in that way for previous tech trends. Since we're talking about, how these agent builders have been evolving, um, Tell me a little bit about like what you think is some of the things that these agent builders typically ignore. I feel like a lot of agent builders can kind of feel and look a little similar. There's these connected boxes that kind of look like a DAG, like an acyclic graph. But tell me a little bit about what you think is functionality that maybe the agent builders might be overlooking today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I probably don't have a strong point of view on like where they could be better agent builders, but I guess I could talk a little bit about where I think they'll never be able to fully solve the problem of like why, like, because there probably is some question there of like why can't just like everything be automated by the like, simple drag and drop tools eventually.
Right.
Like why can't they just build enough sophistication in there? And I think that like the reason, I mean, there's like one aspect which is, the problem is upstream of the agent builder to some extent. It's like it's about, creating clean APIs, creating, good data sets to serve as context for the model and the agents and so forth. Um, so, there's one aspect of it, which is that like most of the problem isn't even the agent builder at all. It's like other things that sit around the agent. Um, but, I think that that's not sufficient because if it was only that, then it's like you'd solve all those problems and you'd go use AgentKit to like actually build your production agent. So I think it's really, at the end of the day, more so the fact that so many of these systems have to be tightly integrated to other existing systems that you have in your organization that um, you really, like you can't, you ultimately it just becomes like more software. Like when you're building this, it's not just some little standalone bot or something like that. It's like you have a huge backend infrastructure of code that you want to be able to maintain and version and apply your same security best practices to and so forth. So it's like you want it to be part of your repo the same way everything else is
Yeah.
and integrated with all these systems. You don't want it to be a standalone thing. And
Yeah.
so maybe that's like one thing that these tools are missing today is like, we can build something very quickly, get it up and running, have it start automating some part of your life, but no one's going to be putting that into production and putting it in front of like millions of their customers because it doesn't have all that other software CI/CD stuff that you expect and need in order to build that level of confidence before it goes live.
So let's actually double click on one of these, which is like confidence before it goes live. This is one thing that I think OpenAI did a great job of introducing or integrating as part of their AI Agent Kit announcement, which was thinking around evals. And so, that we've just gotten a little bit of a teaser towards this, but you can upload these, batch data sets that you can run evals over. You see there's a rating column. There's these I think about them as like output flags, like tone. There's even an ability to give feedback. They have something like trace grading, which looks like where you can create custom graders that are essentially LLM prompts you can run over agent responses. So like they've been thinking about the space. By the way, I think a lot of eval's capabilities around agents look like let's throw a lot of LLM as a judge at the problem. I'm not even convinced that's a bad idea, but I do think that's how a lot of evals work. I, Agent evals feel like a little bit more unique from LLM evals. You not only need to be able to tell is this good or not, but like you need to see was an action successfully completed. What do you think the future of agentic evaluation is going to look like? And people are still getting up to speed on LLM evals. How do you think agent evals is going to differ from agentic evals?
Yeah, what's funny is like when I first started thinking about the agent eval problem, like my first inclination was that, oh, this like LM as a judge stuff is never going to work because, just like evaling a simple prompt and response is hard. How are you going to prompt it? How are you going to eval like this entire complex interaction? The more I thought about it, though, the more I started to come to the opposite conclusion, which is that maybe agents actually are better suited to LM as a judge than other use cases because of the fact that they're typically multi-turn and they also interact with other systems. And so there's some more like objective signal you can get there to say, did the agent call the API that it wanted to call successfully? Like, did it get a 404 or did it actually get what it wanted? Did it get a permission denied error? Stuff like that. If there was a back and forth with the user, like, did the user have to constantly like prod the agent to, go in the right direction, or did the agent figure out what it needed to do pretty quickly? So there is like a bit more rich texture to the interaction that makes it better suited to something like LM as a judge, where you can kind of just look at the whole landscape and say, okay, it did this right, it did this wrong, and ultimately the user got what they wanted or they didn't. And that's usually pretty clear from like the end state of the interaction in most cases. The final response, maybe sometimes not, but everything else, yes. Um, so I definitely feel like there's more potential in solving evals in a more generic way than there was in the past. Because, like, certainly, in the olden days when we were doing data science, no one was going to build like a single eval framework that didn't require any human input that would like figure out like how to evaluate your like super specific recommender system, for example. Right, it's a much like more quantitative problem than like some of these more qualitative problems that agents are solving.
Hmm.
um so yeah, I think it's like, yeah, I don't know.
Even
what
the thing that
went
you
off in a tangent,
like
but
agents, like you can actually use some of the outputs of the systems as a way to grade them, which makes a lot of sense. I think this direction naturally takes us towards this idea around reinforcement learning for agent improvement. OpenAI hints at it. Travis, you and I happen to know a little something about reinforcement fine tuning, in particular for agent applications. I think we launched one of the very first RFT platforms with Predibase in the spring of this year, which was actually quite early towards the market. So, one of the things I'm really excited about being able to talk about next time is what the future for reinforcement learning looks like when it comes towards improving agent applications. But I think that's all the time we have today. So, what I wanted to be able to say is thank you very much for tuning in as we just started to touch a little bit about what the next evolution of agent builders look like and some of the key functionality that we see within there, low code versus no code. And next time, I think we'll be able to touch a little bit more about how people are improving agent systems in the future of the reinforcement learning. Until then, we'll stay in the details. And Travis, thank you again very much for joining today.
thank you.